Help! There's men stranded! All heads turned. What is it, Reed? Murphy grasped the boy's shoulders. With barely a breath left, the boy forced out his words. At the pitch, a middle jam, 4 men. The boy hadn't finished his words and the camp was emptied. Men stampeded down the path. A herd of caribou chased by a wolverine wouldn't have been quicker. I Am Penobscot, a novel by Tommy Carbone. This is an audiobook preview, copyright 2023, by Burnt Jacket Publishing and Tommy Carbone. For additional information on this title and other books, visit TommyCarbone.com. I Am Penobscot, a novel based on the life of David Stone Libbey, Maine pioneer, river driver, and writer. Narrated by the author. Chapter 1, Libbey Rock, at Lumber Camp No. 1, near the Penobscot River, May 1858. The bearded lumberman, in his red-checkered shirt, looked toward the top of the pines. His deep voice echoed over the gorge, while the river rushing over the granite boulders provided the base. He recited his ballad. The Penobscot's a lonesome place. I know there's snow on every tree. And woe betide John Ross for parting of my dear love and me. Ha! Golden, you wouldn't be singing those lyrics if the boss was up here himself, shot Murphy. Aye, the old man has heard it all before, my lad. Dan Golden waved his hand. Besides, he's way down the river by now. Maybe so, but we ought to drown you for him all the same. Murphy blew a halo with his pipe smoke. Why's that, you grumpy old sea hag? Growled Golden. On account of your lousy keeping of a tune, chided Murphy good-naturedly. Muted laughter came from the exhausted lumbermen. They'd had a long day, one that started before sunrise, and to a man, they were so tired they couldn't even sleep. A few, eyes half open, were sitting on butt ends of logs near the fire, elbows on their knees, their heads cradled in their hands. All the others were reclining on a bedroll, half in and half out of their open-ended tents. David, how's about you sing us a song, will ya? Murphy's booming voice carried across the gorge and returned as an echo. His Irish brogue included. Hear, hear! Tin cups banged against stones or chinked against the blade of an axe. Firelight flickered over the bearded faces that all anxiously awaited for a reply. David looked over the top of his book. He was enjoying the story and was wishing the men were all tired out after a day of fighting with logs. Ah, fellas, haven't you had enough entertainment for one evening? By this, he meant the hour of fiddle playing from Pratt, and not the crooning from Golden. That was fine playing. Murphy tipped his hat toward the man holding the fiddle on his knee. And Pratt, you're a good man with a saw as well as that bow. But my lad, by the 10th time you fiddled it, we was all ready to murder that love-struck Billy boy from Blarney. A roar of laughter rang out. The trouble was, although Pratt was a fine fiddle player, he only knew the one song. Libbey, tell us about the jam you cleared at Jerry's Rock, yelled a voice at the end of the row of tents. Now you boys know I didn't help clear that jam. That's okay. We like the way you sing it all the same, said a man named Spencer. They all knew David hadn't had anything to do with that jam, sure as they knew black spruce made for the best gum. They also knew David wasn't one to let any inaccurate rumor go unchecked. He closed his book, the red ribbon given him from Mary marking his place. The act of him rising brought the lumbermen to attention. They seemed to sit up straighter. Several put their pipes aside to be ready to sing the harmony. If it'll make you quiet down so I can read, I'll sing one song. Hey, hey, the men cheered. The men sitting stamped their feet on the packed dirt. Even if they were at a saloon on Bangor's Exchange Street, where a piano player kept them spending their stake, there wouldn't be a better singer to be heard. For it was a woods fact from Mattawamkeag to Chisumcook that David Libbey was the best tenor on the drive. He'd been singing to the accompaniment of peepers and the rushing river for darn near 20 years. There wasn't another river driver on the east or west branch of the Penobscot, and certainly there wasn't anyone on the Kennebec Drive who knew as many ballads as David Libbey. He enjoyed the singing as much as they appreciated listening, even if some songs brought a melancholy feeling over them. Maybe his voice lulled them to sleep. As far as they all were concerned, David was a terribly able river driver who could handle a bateau, pull a peavey, push up river with a pole, and carry a tune better than any singer they'd pay to hear. He started out with a tale, as he always did. You know, boys, we don't really know where Jerry's Rock might be. It could be in Michigan. Maybe it was Wisconsin. Could have been up on the Macagodavik. The men grumbled. They had no interest in hearing the rock was in any of those places. Settle down, he sat on a log close to the fire. Just as well, that rock could have been in Maine, if you're so inclined to believe. But where that boulder was doesn't matter. The point is, there was trouble on the river. And when there was a riverman in trouble, the men did what had to be done. This here version is one I learned from an old river driver, Redland Green. He taught it to me when I was a boy. David had met the lumberman turned singer Redland Green nearly 2 decades ago. David didn't know it at the time, but he'd sing the ballads Red had taught him for nearly a half-century. He added, "When I sing this one, I'm reminded of my brother Joseph." David paused and let his eyes fall from face to face. When his gaze met Murphy's, he stopped. "You knew him well, Murphy." "I sure did." Murphy bowed his head. David looked down the line of nodding heads. "And so did you, Spencer." "Strong bow man he was," added Spencer. "It was only on account of those falls. They were ugly that day. Was it no fault of Joseph's?" "Then you'll all do right to know ballads such as this. It has personal meaning for me when I sing it. Why a group of men off in the deep woods cared to hear a song of death could only be explained by the reasoning they knew of someone who died by the river, and if not, they'd narrowly escaped one too many rocks that could have been named any one of their names. The fact that they made it down the river alive, freshet after spring freshet, was reason enough to remember the dead. Pratt ran his bow across the string in David's key, with the flickering of the orange flames behind him, and the moonlight streaking through the pines. David gazed up to the stars, and his tenor voice filled the night. Come all you bold Penobscot boys, and listen while I relate. Come sit here round the campfire, and listen unto me, concerning a young riverman and his untimely fate. The men sang along with this next line, but not loud enough to drown out David. "'Twas on a jam at Jerry's Rock, he met his watery grave." David let the melody die into the silence, broken only by the peepers before he began the next verse. "'Twas on a Sunday morning, as you will quickly hear. Our logs were piled mountain high, we could not keep them clear. The boss cried out, 'Turn out, brave boys, with hearts devoid of fear. We'll break the jam on Jerry's Rock, and for Bangor we'll all steer.'" By the end of the second verse, men from the outer row of tents had made their way closer. The background level of the harmony had increased, and at the mention of Bangor, they held a note, surely thinking of their girls and the saloons where they'd spend their pay. David had paused for the echo to die out. The bark of a birch log crackled in the fire. He nodded at the now awake faces and sang. "Now some of them were willing, while others they were not. For to work on jams on Sunday, they did not think they ought. But 6 of our Penobscot boys did volunteer to go and break the jam on Jerry's Rock with their foreman, young Monroe." A joker, who hadn't come out of his tent, changed the final line, and in the pause when David was taking a breath, he sung out, "Oh no, I thought it was with their foreman, old Murphy." Murphy pointed his pipe. "Aye, you watch yourself, McCarthy. You'll be assistant to the cookie come the morning. David let the men settle. Pratt drew his bow across the strings. They had not rolled off many logs when they heard his clear voice say, "I'd have you boys be on your guard. The jam will soon give way." These words were scarcely spoken when the mast did break and go, and it carried off those 6 brave lads and their foreman, young Monroe. "Help! There's men stranded! Men are struck on a jam!" The cries for help stopped David cold. All heads turned. A young lumberman, his first year on the drive, still yet a teenager, came running up the trail. "What is it, Reed?" Murphy grasped the boy's shoulders. With barely a breath left, the boy forced out his words. "At the pitch, a middle jam, 4 men." The boy hadn't finished his words and the camp was emptied. Men stampeded down the path. A herd of caribou chased by a wolverine wouldn't have been quicker. They jumped over stumps, and their caulk boots split chunks of bark and snapped the sticks that littered the tote road. An odd sight it would have been to see near 100 men, wearing their red underwear and boots, running through the woods by the light of the waxing gibbous moon. While the men at the camp were moments ago ready for sleep, there was always something to be done on the river to keep the logs moving, and men willing to do it. It was the men of the night crew who had been watching the river, poking errant logs to the next deadwater. It should have been routine work. Only later would inquiry reveal that too many logs had been sluiced over the dam upstream, overwhelming the small crew who had moved down to the rapids to avoid a jam from forming. But they were too late. On a cluster of rocks, granite obelisks lying on the riverbed, the legend said they were thrown off the side of Katahdin by Pomola. A jam had been building. The men were picking it, trying to find the key log in order the jam didn't build up mountain high overnight. They couldn't let it gain on them. Those men were picking that jam so the others could rest. While they were all good men with a peavey, when the key log pushed free, the men hadn't time to jump in the bateau that was holding to shuttle them to safety. Instead, they had scrambled to a section of logs that clung for no good reason to a rock located mid-river. To all who ran to help, none of what happened or how mattered. All that mattered was saving those men. Upstream from the jam, David gazed out at the shadow of logs twisted about the rocks. The gray figures of 4 men were crouched tightly on the granite ledge in river center. He couldn't see their faces over the dark distance, and not knowing who'd been left to work, he didn't know who they were, but he certainly knew them. Rushing water split left and right of the newly formed timber island. Free logs ran through the chute between shore and the jam, acting as battering rams, knocking logs free, one at a time. "Where's the boatman?" David asked the boy who stood on the riverbank alongside of him. "He was washed down the river when the jam broke." A man in a bateau always waded close to a jam. The only escape the men picking the jam would have would be to make a jump into the boat. It was apparent to David that when the jam started to give way, and before the men could get in the boat, the rush of the water conspired to move the boat off the wing of logs that jutted out into the river. A single man to handle a 30-foot boat was rarely possible on the river, unless in a deadwater. The men on the jam were counted on to jump in the boat to help paddle ashore. Without them, the boatman was at the mercy of the river, in a predicament of his own, headed toward the rapids of the pitch. His luck was worse than the men stranded, at least so far. "David, we're ready." While David was assessing the water flow, the distance to the jam, and the best way out to the men, his crew was readying his bateau. His boat, christened Joseph's Carry, was custom built to his specifications after he'd studied many a riverboat designs. The braces were from knees he had dug with his own hands that he delivered to the old town builder, Garish Gill, who'd made the boat to the length, width, and depth of David's drawing. The Libbey boat was the steadiest craft on the Penobscot River, although it only behaved as such with David in it, a paddle or pole in his hand. If it wasn't said, it was known. The actual boat didn't matter. The skill was in the man. He turned to his crew. "We need to carry up beyond the eddy. We'll put in there." David grabbed his pole. The one positive, if you were looking for one, was the men were stranded close to the camp and men were there ready for the call. On David's advice, 3 bateaux were shuffled up the carry road. Each 4-man crew knew the river. They also knew the river never behaved the same from one day to the next. The eager crew of the lead boat launched, and within 2 minutes, the second boat followed down the quick water. Both boats shimmering eerily in the moonlight as night coaches on an errand. "You ready, David?" Charles Nilson stood across from David, wondering why his friend had not picked up his corner of the bow. Jot and James had already lifted the stern and stood waiting. "Give those 2 crews some time." David watched the boats disappear down the river. From the top of the carry, the distance was too far, and the darkness too dark, to see if the boats had made it to the men. Looking upriver, young Reed questioned the boss. "Why's Libbey not launching?" Murphy looked upriver. Assessing." Murphy kept his eyes on the water, trying to read the current. "He'll wait to hear what happens." The boy wasn't accustomed to seeing men stranded, left to the mercy of the water. Anxiously, he paced the bank. He said nothing of who was out on the jam. And while all their lives were important, there was one man on that jam whose death Reed wasn't ready to witness. 100 lumbermen lined the carry road. Each one stood 10 feet apart from the next. To a man, they knew what would be needed and had self-organized without anyone telling them where to go. The first boat crew misjudged the brute of a river. Navigating the rapids was no easy feat during the light of day, and it was doubly difficult in the dark. The boat was swept past the stranded men faster than driftwood. The bowman slammed his paddle on the gunwale. His frustration was evident. It had been his responsibility to guide the boat gently to what was left of the logs clinging to the rocks. He'd had to pull wide at the last moment. That was the right thing to do. His boat was coming in too fast. Then it went sideways, knocking 2 end logs free before the men had a chance to jump for safety. "Missed wide! Missed wide! Missed wide!" The yell was relayed back up the half-mile of carry road from man to man as nearly as fast as a telegraph might have carried the signal. The men at the top of the carry road, not having seen what had transpired, groaned audibly at hearing the news. Out on the jam, the mood was no better. "We're dead men." The oldest man on the jam was resolved to meet his fate. His wife had told him for the past 7 years to take up a different profession, and now, here he was, 40 years old, and going to drown in the river. "Anyone got a dry smoke?" "Here's my last one. No dry matches, though," said a river driver with a grin. Thanks. I'll chew it just the same, then." "How can you 2 joke around? We might not get out of this alive," said a third man. "Alive? You'll be lucky to come out of this with your head still attached to your neck." The old veteran driver calmly peeled the tobacco out of the cigarette and put it in his mouth. He'd buried 6 men along Maine rivers over his years. He expected his time would come eventually. The fourth lad, the youngest, sat quietly. He watched the yellow-orange flames being carried by the invisible hands of the men along the shore. The motion resembled a native ceremony he'd only read about happening in the mountains of the West. The yells of the men on shore couldn't be heard, except through his imagination, brought to him by the chaotic movement of the burning birch torches. A wad of moist tobacco was spat at the river. "It's that darned Pomola. He's whipping up this wind. I've never had any use for him at all." "Stop it! Stop that talk now!" The young kid's voice cracked. "Don't be offending the spirits." Back up the carry, Jot walked to the bow and stood next to David. "This wind is blowing to bang the apostles. I say we go in on the far side." "That side is full of boulders." Charles shook his head. "That'd be crazy." "Jot's right, Charles. We got to work with the wind." David lifted his corner of the boat. "On 3. David's boat bounced up and down on the foam, dropping and rising with the rolling waves. On the shallow far side, the men used their poles to slow the boat and hold. Addion's boat, ahead of them, was coming up on the jam. If Addion and his crew could get all 4 men into their boat, they would do so. If not, it would be left to David's crew, that's if the logs held, and the men were still there to be rescued. Addion's bateau was pushed against the logs where the men squatted, readying to jump. The logs shifted. The donator of the cigarette made a leap and landed in the center of the boat. From the force of his momentum, the boat pushed away. The tobacco chewer misjudged his jump and landed in the water. He was pushed under before anyone could get hold of him. The crew dug at the water with their oars, hoping the current would take them in the same direction their fellow log runner was being dragged. Nobody could see where he went. Out on the far side of the river, David and his crew could see the shadows of 2 men still on the logs. They lifted their poles and began their descent downriver. Now they were in a desperate race against the lingering logs, barely resisting the river's force. They worked furiously against the current. 1 man was already in the cold water. The other 2 only had minutes before the remaining logs would lift off the rocks, and they too would be dragged down the river toward the falls. "Will David be able to get there in time?" Reed yelled to Murphy as they ran down the Carry Road. Murphy didn't respond. He didn't have an answer and was huffing too much to be able to answer if he knew. Murphy stepped into the pucker brush to catch his breath as a crew carrying a bateau headed up the carry path with a 4th boat. There was nothing David could say to his crew. They wouldn't have heard him anyway over the roar of the river. If they didn't know what they each had to do, they wouldn't be in David Libbey's boat. Each of them he'd hand-selected for his crew, and each one of them were terribly able rivermen. He'd been friends with Charles and Jot since childhood, each of whom had proven themselves capable under pressure. The stern man, James White, while a brother-in-law by marriage, was David's best friend, and as much of a brother as another could be. David trusted James with his life. Water splashed into the boat in bucket-sized blasts. In seconds, their wool clothing was drenched with the barely above freezing water. Only adrenaline kept them from feeling the cold. The pounding water fought the men. Jagged granite rocks tore at the bateau bottom. With all their strength, the crew pulled towards the jam until the water became too deep. Then they took up their paddles once again. No words were said. Their full purpose in life at that moment was not being washed past what logs remained on that jam. The mighty pines were peeling off one by one as they were uplifted to freely ride the current. Murphy had sent men upstream to lower the dam, but the river was still rising. It would be determined later that in the men's haste to help, they had dropped the gates on logs that were now wedged, allowing the water to flow at full pressure. Downstream from the dam, a few timbers remained teetering on the granite. The 2 men crouched close to the boulder, willing the logs to hold. In the force of that water, there wasn't a man on the entire log drive that could run a log down that pitch. Both men knew once the final logs untangled, there wouldn't be enough room on what was going to be left of the rock above the water for both of them. As far as any man on the river that night knew, no man had ever survived a dunk in the rapids on this stretch of the Penobscot River. All waited on David Libbey and his crew. In David's boat, the unspoken strategy was to fight against the unstoppable force of the river. Navigating in the dark around unseen boulders was the job of the bowman, and that was David. He watched the swirl of the water, the foam, and the spray. His challenge was to keep the right course, which could barely be seen, and to position his boat in line with the men so they could jump to safety. He had to give them the right distance, and they had to know their timing for what would be the leap of their life. James used his paddle in the stern to hold direction, and when they could get hold of the bottom with their 10-foot poles, Jot and Charles controlled the boat foot by foot, sometimes going back up the river to adjust the course. How Libby's crew was able to gently glide that long boat against what was left of that logjam in water that could float a stone was a testament to the men's ability to handle boat, as the term went. At the landing, the 3 men who were staved received slaps on their backs to welcome them back to drive another day. Reed grasped his brother's hand as he stepped from Libby's boat. The fourth man, the one who'd fallen in the river, was washed downstream, and even though he drank an awful amount of the West Branch, causing him to swallow the tobacco he was chewing, he lived to tell about it. David and the crew emptied their boat of water and paddles. No celebration of accolades was expected or given. There were a lot of whispers in camp that night. One of those men, he cursed Pomola. Would be never wise to do that again. Should Libby have gone first to save the other two boats from the danger? If the second boat had been Libby, would Printy not have taken that Duncan? No one could give a correct answer to any of the questions, and it wasn't as if anyone was expecting any answers. Reed approached Murphy, who was sipping extra strong spruce tea with Golden and Spencer. "How's your brother?" Murphy asked. "He's sleeping. Took him a while to get the chill and shock out of him." Reed motioned a thumb toward Libby's tent. "Why was Libby the only one to know to go to the far side of the river?" the young boy asked. Murphy tugged at his red, scraggly beard. "Libby's crew was able to hold steady and get those men off because they know the Penobscot." He thought a moment. "No, they did it because they are Penobscot." Golden poked at the fire with a stick. "We ought to name that rock." And so it became. That cluster of sharp granite, with a view of Katahdin to the west, has ever been known as Libby Rock. Not because someone died there, but rather as a tribute to a terribly able river driver and his crew. David was too exhausted to get back to his reading. He changed from his wet clothes into his only spare Union suit, placed his wool blanket over his bed of hemlock, and rolled into a cocoon. Within moments, he was dreaming of trout fishing in much calmer waters. It would be 7 years from that night on the Penobscot River when David and his friend Charles would again be called to handle a boat together in dire circumstances. However, an ugly, roaring river wouldn't be the only enemy they would face when that call would come. Thank you for listening. This has been an audio preview. You can now download the ebook from Apple Books. The full audiobook is pending release.